I absolutely have very little sympathy with the idea that greater protection for women is somehow harming men.
Hi everyone, and welcome to In Solidarity, the Open Democracy podcast. Please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. My name is Sian Norris, and I'm the Senior Investigations Reporter at Open Democracy. And today we're joined by Penny East, Chief Executive of the Fawcett Society, the UK's leading feminist NGO. To mark 1 year of Labour being in power, the Fawcett Society published a briefing looking at their successes and failures when it came to their commitments to women's equality. Today we're going to be discussing that track record, including the highs, such as the amendment to decriminalise abortion in England and Wales, the ban on NDAs as part of the Workers' Rights Bill, and the promises and commitments to improve and review maternal health care across the NHS. But of course, it's not a glowing report card, and we're also going to be looking at the various commitments which Labour have yet to fulfil when it comes to supporting and promoting women's equality. But we're also going to explore why we are still having this conversation in 2025. Why are women still being victimised by systemic misogyny and institutionalised sexism? Why are young men growing up with negative attitudes towards women and girls? And how is this fueling violence against women and girls? And what on earth can politicians, charities, NGOs, campaigners and activists do to quell this overwhelming wave of misogyny that we are seeing online and offline, and that is warping and changing attitudes towards women and men? So I wanted to start with some of the positives that we've seen from the Labour government. I think in this dark time with the rise of misogyny, the Trump regime, the rise of reform, it can be very easy to get stuck on the terrible things that are going on. But we have seen some good changes under Labour. Decriminalisation of abortion, the ban on non-disclosure agreements, various things in the Workers' Rights Bill. So what are some of the kind of positive things that you've seen and feel like we need to be recognising as achievements for the women's sector?
Certainly. Well, actually, there was a really good piece of news that was published only yesterday, which didn't get a huge amount of coverage, but that was the government committing, I think, £53 million to perpetrator work in domestic abuse. So this is a program called Drive, which is dealing with some of the most high risk, high harm serial perpetrators in the country. And I was involved in launching it many years ago and then sat on its board. And it's a fantastic program that's really focused on making sure that perpetrators are being held accountable for their actions, installing behaviour change, working with police and crime commissioners across the country. So that £53 million means that it can be rolled out into every area of the country. I think the important thing to say, of course, with that is that investment in perpetrator work, while brilliant in terms of getting to the root cause of domestic abuse, needs to be matched with support for survivor and victim services, which obviously many of them are in huge financial difficulty. And it is so hard to do that work when you don't have that financial security. In terms of other wider provisions, and particularly things that Fawcett have been campaigning on, as you say, the ban of NDAs is a huge step forward. Also, the announcement around the Employment Rights Bill that women are going to get more support when they lose a baby before 24 weeks, so that they will get time off work in order to recover both physically and mentally from that loss. So that feels like a really positive change, recognizing women's experiences and making sure that employers are more responsible. And then, of course, around the prevention of sexual harassment at work as well. That feels like another thing that we've really seen progress over the last year. And the legislation is trying to catch up with what is a kind of very underreported challenge of sexual harassment within the workplace. I think it's around 40% of women have been sexually harassed at work. And of course, it is something that's so underreported because unfortunately, women still feel, for very understandable reasons, that their career may be impacted if they disclose what has happened in the workplace. So that kind of change in the legislation to make sure that employers take steps to prevent sexual harassment rather than just respond after it's happened feels like a really welcome step forward.
Absolutely. And I've reported on the issue of what we call third-party sexual harassment, particularly in the NHS, which in an NHS context is when patients, for example, harass medical staff such as nurses. And having done my stint as a younger woman in waitressing, I can definitely attest to the problems of third-party sexual harassment. So it's really positive to see that the government is taking action on this. But of course, it's being framed by some who oppose it as the banter ban. Like, why do we need to have these protections for women and for men, obviously?
There's a lot of talk, isn't there, always about getting women into sectors where they're not usually represented, like women into STEM and women into engineering and women into, and I obviously absolutely support that. But I also think part of the narrative needs to be supporting sectors that are disproportionately held up by women: social care, social work, teaching, the NHS. These are sectors that are kind of 80-90% female workforce. And we need to make sure that the improvements in legislation are benefiting them as well as women who are working in offices. And I think some of the media narrative around the employment changes is quite often focused on a more kind of corporate idea of work rather than frontline public sector roles. In terms of the stuff around banter, well, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I know that in the way the law is currently framed, context does matter. So that there have been there's case law to show that um when an office is uh there's banter in the office, I don't know, like in a sales environment or something, that sometimes they don't find in the women's favor, in order because they think that essentially it's kind of the norm within that context of the employer. I mean, to me, that's really problematic because obviously everyone that joins the office therefore just adopts that mindset and that kind of way of talking to one another as default. And it makes it anyone that joins really powerless to make that change. I mean, the thing about banter is I have a very little sympathy with the idea of a man not knowing when he's making a woman feel uncomfortable. Indeed, I remember reading about one case where the man said something, an older boss said to a younger female staff member, "Oh, you look very good today." And then, which as a comment, is kind of standalone comment. But then the second part of the comment was, and this is where they did find him guilty of sexual harassment, was, "And of course, I'm not meant to say that, am I?" And it's that part of it where actually men do know when they're crossing the line. They do know when they're making women feel uncomfortable. I don't have much sympathy with this idea that kind of suddenly men feel like they can't say anything anymore. Rapport and understanding what's going, and also the workplace just isn't a suitable place for that kind of banter. Because women need to feel equal, they need to feel respected, and that is incredibly hard if they're working in an environment where their looks or their sexuality is something that men feel that they can analyze or joke about.
I completely agree. And I also think the flip side of that as well is that women tend to know the difference between a compliment, someone being nice, a joke, and something that makes them feel uncomfortable. Like, women understand this because it's something we've been dealing with since we were teenagers, and we know where those lines are and when they're being crossed. And I think the massive issue of sexual harassment in the workplace and third party sexual harassment is so vast that actually anything that can be done to support women in those spaces and make it clear that some behavior is unacceptable has to be recognized. And it's really distressing to me that it's just being dismissed in this kind of, oh, you can't say anything anymore, they're trying to criminalize flirting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, unfortunately, there is obviously a growing voice around that stuff, isn't there? Around young men online creating that feeling that feminism and women speaking up for themselves is becoming increasingly problematic. And that kind of narrative that, oh, you can't say anything anymore, and that feminism has somehow made boys and men scared in some way, or has had an effect on their self-esteem or their sense of freedom or their identity. Again, I mean, I think it's really important to think about masculinity and men's mental health, of course, but I absolutely have very little sympathy with the idea that greater protection for women is somehow harming men.
Yeah, it's not a piece of pie, is it? Like, everybody benefits when women have better equality and access to rights. And of course, I mentioned at the introduction, one of the big achievements of this Labour government was the vote on the amendment to decriminalise abortion. I mean, this is something that I've written about extensively. I mean, what impact will the decriminalisation amendment have when it goes through?
I think it's a really, really welcome step forward. And I think it really understands or moves us to understanding the vulnerability of a woman going through that experience, and also the impact on a woman's body when we're reading about cases about women who have been arrested or had criminal charges put against them when they have had an abortion. The absolute lack of compassion or understanding within the public sector towards women in that position of what our bodies need and what our minds need during that time. So, yeah, I think it's a really welcome step forward. It's really great to see it get across the line, and Fawcett were really proud to support it.
Yeah, it was a great moment. I'm not ashamed to say that I cried listening to the debate. It felt really historic. Um, but of course, we can't just give Labour tick, tick, tick on things that they've done for women. There are a lot of promises in the 2024 manifesto around women's equality and access to rights. And there are still some gaps in what we're seeing, particularly, I think, around women's health. And Fawcett has raised the issue about concerns over the prioritisation of women's health in future plans. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, of course. So in terms of women's health, obviously there was the 10-year NHS plan that got published a couple of weeks ago, which is kind of a very ambitious transformational plan for the NHS. And there's a lot of stuff in there that we should be pleased about. There's a lot of ambition, um, and a lot of determination to do things differently and to create a kind of more holistic approach to health. I think in terms of women's health, unfortunately, the gender health gap has actually widened, and the outcomes for women are worsening at a faster rate than they are for men. And one thing that I'd really like to understand from government is what is happening around women's health, the women's health strategy. So there was a women's health strategy published, I think, under Johnson, so quite some time ago, which is kind of sitting there on the government's website saying this was last published in 2021 or whenever it was. And then, of course, the Secretary of State has published a consultation to inform a men's health strategy. Excellent, absolutely. Fawcett's very supportive of that. But there doesn't seem to be a lot of movement on the women's health strategy, and it seems very unclear about whether that strategy is still being adhered to. How does it fit with the NHS 10-year plan? So what we'd really like to see is some pace, and some sense of urgency about bringing that women's health strategy up to date and making sure that it sits together coherently with the NHS plan. Because while improvements in things like referral times and waiting lists is obviously very welcome, we actually just need to look at the structural issues that mean that women's health is quite often ignored, or symptoms are misdiagnosed, or women just aren't being heard within the system. And those are structural issues and require a strategy that fits across the whole health and social care system in order to work.
And of course, one of the areas in which women are not listened to and, dare I say it, not trusted in their own experience of health is pregnancy and maternity. And we have seen some, positive steps from Streeting announcing that they're going to be looking at a review of maternity units. But what are the kind of issues that women continue to face around childbirth and pregnancy?
Childbirth is one of the most, it can be joyous, but it can also be incredibly terrifying and traumatizing. And to know that you are going to give birth to a child in a unit that has already been unsafe, that has already been deemed inadequate due to the fact of staffing shortages, problems with team culture, problems with lack of training, lack of support for midwives. No, it's never a case of criticizing individual practitioners. They are working within a structure and a system that doesn't have the resources necessary for them to give the women the care that they want to give them. And yeah, I mean, I have two children. I can't tell you that both births were incredibly challenging and indeed and incredibly difficult. And indeed, I have also lost a baby as well. And I know what that feels like during COVID as well. And that was hugely traumatizing. And to be in a place when you're going through loss, when you're going through incredible amounts of pain, and to just know that no one has the time. No one has the time. It's 30 seconds here and then you wait for 7 hours and it's 30 seconds there. Um, it's, as I say, absolutely not the fault of any individual practitioner, midwives or doctors, or any healthcare assistants, but it is absolutely a structural issue. And I just think that it hasn't been taken seriously for too long, and women have put up with it for too long. And thank goodness Streeting says that he's going to do something about it. And I really, really hope that when that review comes out in Christmas, that we see the resources matched with the scale of the problem. Because once again, we can write a report to say what the issues are, but until you put the resources behind it to resolve those issues, it's not going to get better.
I guess another intersection as well with women's health is an issue around poverty and welfare. And we know that sort of one of the impacts of the long tail of austerity is women having a longer, what we call an unhealthy life expectancy, so living with complicated health issues for a longer period of time. I mean, again, what sort of attitudes are we seeing from Labour around welfare and poverty? And obviously, there's been a lot of controversy about their attitudes towards welfare and votes on welfare, but how does that impact women?
Yeah, certainly. It's something that we are increasingly looking at. I mean, we have been campaigning around the gender pay gap for a very, very long time, of course. And the gender pay gap actually last year widened for the first time in a decade. So things, unfortunately, are going in the wrong direction. And of course, when women, because either they're in insecure, low paid work and they're not being paid enough, or because they are disabled or on some sort of welfare support and that is being reduced, the key thing to remember with that is, apart from obviously the link to poverty, and the kind of anxiety and stress that comes from that financial insecurity, there's also the added reality that for many of those women, or for a significant minority of them, certainly, they will be in situations that may be unsafe. And the economic freedom and independence is the absolute key to leaving abusive or harmful relationships of any kind. And I think it's important when talking about domestic abuse that, of course, we do usually think of it as a kind of intimate partner in terms of boyfriend, partner, husband, but domestic abuse can be any member of the family, including, I remember when I was working at Safe Lives, doing lots of work or looking at the societal trend of adult children living at home for much longer, and they're actually seeing adult sons being abusive to their mothers who are in their 50s, 60s, and 70s, and adult sons in their 20s and 30s being incredibly abusive to their own mothers. And that kind of cuts to welfare, or the gender pay gap, or indeed the pension gap as well. So the disparity in terms of pension as well has a huge impact on a woman's economic freedom and sense of independence, and her ability to leave abusive relationships or indeed harmful relationships within the home. So I think it's kind of understanding the impact on a woman, not just in terms of pounds and pence, but in terms of her own relationships and her safety.
Absolutely. And I think the Women's Budget Group did some really great, I mean, I say great, horrifying research a few years ago on how single women in England can't afford to rent or buy their own home. And that might seem like, oh, just get a housemate, just get a house share. But the impact of that, if you're in a domestic abuse situation and knowing that you are at risk of being homeless, we know that there are examples of women being found to be intentionally homeless when they leave abusive households. I remember reporting years ago on a council that asked a woman to provide a letter from her abuser saying that he was abusing her so that they could prove she was unintentionally homeless. So if you don't have that economic security and if you don't have that safety net, the risks to women who are trying to leave are, impossible.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I actually have a neighbor here who, someone that lives quite near me, who's a friend of mine, who was in an abusive relationship a few years ago. He was financially abusing her as well. She managed to leave that relationship, but he somehow kept the house. And she moved into a rented house near here. And now the landlord wants to sell up. And because she is working in insecure, low paid work, she can't get a rental because she can't get the deposit together, because landlords are now demanding 2, 3, 4 months. When I was renting, it was always a month's deposit, but now it's much more than that. And also, obviously, they want to see bank statements for 6 to 9 months. And of course, she's being financially abused. So her financial statements aren't where they should be. And she's going to have to declare herself homeless. That's what's going on currently, is her speaking to our local authority. And they're saying you're going to have to declare yourself homeless. And she'll be put in some sort of insecure housing situation. She'll be put in a hostel. She's in her 50s. She's worked every day of her life. And how we've got to a place where a woman who did exactly what society tells her to do, leave the man and get herself free and carry on going to work and carry on looking after her kids and doing all that stuff. And yet here she is, 50 years old, and she's going to be put in a hostel. It's completely unacceptable.
We know that this government has said that it wants to halve violence against women and girls in the next 10 years, and that's one of its flagship policies. And we've talked about the really positive news yesterday about the drive funding. But what sort of gaps are we seeing at the moment? And also, are there good things that we're seeing at the moment beyond the drive funding to reach this important target?
I think the biggest gap is provision for specialist services for victims and survivors. I mean, I remember when Drive was launched a decade ago, maybe, that it was pretty controversial when it was launched. I think there was a fair amount of criticism, um, because, of course, in a funding environment where it's so pressured, the idea of putting some of that funding towards the men that are causing the problem feels very unfair to the victims and survivors who are currently working within a system that is underfunded. But of course, the argument being that until we get to the root cause of the problem, which is the perpetrator, we will just see those serial perpetrators committing more and more crimes. But I think that is the biggest gap, that while the perpetrator work is great to be invested, we need to see that being matched with support for victims and survivors. Um, I think also some transparency about how that metric is going to be measured. I mean, I don't have a sense of how they're going to measure it in terms of what data sets they're going to use, in terms of how they're defining it. And I think the other bit, which is this massive, it's like opening Pandora's box on it, but is about the fact that the root cause, really, I mean, apart from obviously dealing with men who are committing these crimes already, men who will be in their 20s, 30s, and 40s and older, is getting to the root cause in terms of misogyny. And that really, I mean, since I've joined Fawcett and since kind of talking to different stakeholders and partners and academics, and obviously, I mean, it's not like it's not been in the news a huge amount, but that the rise of online misogyny and the easy access of incredibly violent misogynistic content by young boys is it's something that I think government has a bit of a grip on. I mean, I know there was a news story last week or maybe earlier this week even about teaching anti-misogyny in schools, but it all just feels like little piecemeal bits. And I just don't know how you get to the point where you have the kind of policy and resource landscape that is, what's the word, equivalent to the size of the problem, because the scale of misogyny and the kind of, obviously, the algorithmic bias, meaning that a young boy can be seeing kind of sexist material where they're criticizing girls, using some sexist tropes around girls, how quickly that can go from that to incredibly violent misogynistic content, because of the algorithm feeding content that obviously is getting more and more violent and kind of radicalizing young minds, is probably, well, no, definitely the most kind of terrifying and worrying thing that I have come across since becoming chief exec.
Absolutely. And, I always was really grateful to Fawcett when they stood up for me when I was under attack by some very misogynistic far right people online. And they put out a statement saying that they were standing in solidarity with me, which really meant a lot because, as you can imagine, that was a very intense period. Um, but I think it's completely true. And as you mentioned, we have seen an update to the relationship health and sex education guidance, which is looking now at misogyny, which, the previous government was weakening RHSC and saying, for example, that they didn't want RHSC to teach about domestic violence until children were 14, which, if you're in a domestic violence situation, is too late. And obviously, there are ways of teaching it without traumatizing or triggering children. So that does feel like a positive step. But I guess the big mechanism has been the online safety bill. And where is sort of Labour with that? And do you see different ways in which we can start tackling this kind of misogynistic content that is, I mean, I don't hesitate to use the word grooming, really, of grooming young boys into horrific behaviours?
Yeah, absolutely. So there has been real progress on that. MPs like Jessa Sato have been doing great work in terms of things like banning strangulation, women being strangled in pornography, for example. I mean, the fact that that has to be banned is grim in itself. But it's that normalization of behaviors like that, which then you do see repeated in, and boys and girls thinking that that's normal and things that you can do in kind of your everyday sex lives without necessarily getting consent. And but I do think that Labour are making some effort to make progress with this, and also bringing in things like stricter rules around platforms having to check for age verification and that kind of thing. I think and sharing AI generated content as well has become illegal, but having the apps still hasn't. So there's always gaps in legislation. There's always those kind of loopholes or bits and pieces that need to be sorted out. So while sharing AI content which depicts women in a violent and degrading way is being made illegal, then those Nudify apps you can still make. And actually, indeed, you can make the Nudify apps yourself. If you know how the data is open source, you can go and build it. And with those Nudify apps, which is where you have a picture of a any girl or woman that you could either have taken. She could be a friend of yours, or she could be a girl that you found online. She can be fully dressed, absolutely fully dressed. But obviously, these apps will remove her clothes, present an image of what it thinks that she looks like naked, and then do various horrific, demeaning things with that content. And those apps, the programming behind them, they only work on a female body. I mean, that's, there's no kind of gray area about the motivation behind the use of those apps. It is to demean, belittle, and abuse women and girls. And I think it's really important to understand that even if the content isn't real, in the sense that it's not, it's not like revenge porn where men and boys are using content that was real, but they're using it to abuse. Um, but the effect on the girl in the image is obviously hugely profound and upsetting and terrifying. And yeah, so I think while there has been progress made, the technology and the way it's being utilized is happening at such a pace, it's very, very hard for legislation to keep up.
And I think it's really important what you said, raised there as well, because I think a lot of the conversation has happened about pornographic deepfakes has focused on celebrity. And obviously that is terrible. Like, no woman in the public eye should have to go through that. It's incredibly distressing and traumatizing and abusive. But there is also, we know from research, that this is happening to people who are not, not famous. And it's happening to children as well. There's a horrible growth in AI child sex abuse, where these apps are being used to create images of child sex abuse with children that the abusers know, which is just horrifying. We've walked through into some dystopic tech future that you could never have imagined 10 years ago. But obviously, we've talked a lot about Labour, but there's also all of this misogyny is happening in a sort of broader right, hard right, far right, Christian nationalist, whatever Christian right, whatever conversation you want to call it, with the rise of Trump and the normalization of misogyny in political leadership. And of course, with the rise of reform, and Nigel Farage has historically made comments that are favourable towards people like Andrew Tate, a sort of leading misogynistic influencer. I mean, do you want to comment on sort of the backlash that women are facing from the political sphere, as well as the sort of, where we are with the government?
Yeah, definitely. And I think with Trump, with Musk, and kind of with all that comes with it, there is obviously is providing validation for some of that stuff we were just talking about the rise of accessible misogyny online and the influence on attitudes of young boys and young men, that when they see Andrew Tate and all the mini Andrew Tates, of which there are hundreds, going around with their flash cars and pretending to be much richer than they actually are, I don't know how, a teacher in a secondary school doing a couple of lessons on anti-misogyny is ever going to beat the appeal to young teenage minds of Andrew Tate, and indeed looking at Trump and Musk, the power, the money, the fame, and the fact that those men are peddling openly misogynistic views, and not just kind of being self-proclaimed misogynist. I mean, Tate does literally describe himself as a misogynist, but also we have this line of conspiracy theory as well that sits around it, this kind of interlinking between misogynistic attitudes to women and conspiracy theories as well, that kind of don't trust mainstream society, don't trust the media, is also really interlinked. I remember when Russell Brand was arrested most recently, or maybe it was his court case, and he tweeted something, and then Musk said something along the lines of, you're saying something they don't want to hear when they have to make up stories about you. So not only is he defending Russell Brand, but he's also kind of obviously strongly insinuating that there's some sort of darker plan going on that means that they are bringing down men like the media or society or the man or the deep state are bringing down men like Russell Brand because they're truth sayers. So it's not just defending misogynists, it's putting them on a pedestal to say, haha, they're saying something that nobody wants you to hear, which obviously to a young mind is incredibly appealing. I mean, being a teenager is really, really hard. It's a really vulnerable time. It's like time of who am I in society? What is my identity? What do I mean? What my kind of a time of real struggling with low self-esteem. Maybe I'm just talking about my own teenage years here. But it is for most teenagers, being a teenager is hard. And so those kinds of messages with those men as the poster boys, I mean, it's terrifying. it's not hard to imagine how captivating it is for them. The question is, what do we do to counter it? And then in terms of the UK kind of domestic based stuff, well, obviously Farage and reform, it's not in it's I'm not going to be so simplistic to say it's all the same. It's not all the same. But obviously he has Farage and reform have been very explicit about their views on things like equality and diversity in the workplace, around, when we're fighting for things like affordable childcare from the age of 9 months. I think there's going to be a really interesting, concerning discussion around things like traditional values and families, about the fact that we have made loads of progress about things like affordable childcare, but how will that be? What will the priority be if reform were to get in? And not even if reform were to get in, but if reform were to form the official opposition, what does that mean for our politics as a whole in terms of a complete shift to the right? And that things like affordable childcare, improved parental leave, flexible working. So it's not just the sharp end of misogynistic content with the Tate brothers and all that. It's also just the kind of progress on rights generally, where we're trying to make the world a more fair and equal place for women, so they're able to work if they want to, etc. That's really, really concerning. Concerning because of what reform is saying, but also concerning about what Labour think that they need to do in order to counter reform's argument, and that is shift to the right. And it feels definitely like an uphill battle. It feels like the problem in terms of everything we've talked about today, online misogyny, domestic abuse, and so on, is even more pronounced possibly than in previous decades. And yet the kind of political landscape feels really, really challenging as well. I mean, it's great to have a Labour government, and in some ways they had lots of brilliant stuff in their manifesto. We really need to see them commit to those values and commit to those pledges, and not be tempted to let some of it fall by the wayside, or to kind of walk away from some of those pledges because of the fear of reform. And I think that's where Fawcett and the women's sector as a whole really has its work cut out, and we need to make sure that we're working strongly in partnership together to provide a kind of counter narrative to what's going on.
Absolutely. I mean, I went undercover in a reform rally a few months ago, and there is just no way that Labour can outright reform. Like, reform hate them. There's no policy platform that they can do that will make reform voters be like, oh, actually, that's the right-wing Labour that I want. So we absolutely need to be pushing for social justice and socially fair policies that, recognise the vulnerability that we face right now in terms of equality and in terms of human rights. We always ask our guests one final question, which is, what does solidarity mean to you?
I think in terms of solidarity, in terms of the challenges we've talked about today and the current climate, I'm going to say that solidarity is about coming together and supporting one another, even if you don't agree on everything. And I think that the feminist movement as a whole, it's just obviously no surprise, it's not new news to anybody that there are many issues actually where feminism disagrees, not just the most obvious ones, but there are many issues that feminism disagrees. But everything that we've discussed about in terms of the size of the problem, that's what we need. Even if we disagree, we need to be facing in the same direction about the fact that actually our young boys and men are being fed content, as I say, that is honestly will have huge societal impact for decades to come. And as I say, this shift to the right, both in terms of American politics and in the UK, these are the huge problems that we need to face. And we can stand in solidarity and support one another, even if there are specific issues where we don't necessarily always agree.
This episode of In Solidarity was made possible thanks to the support from the David McClure Trust. The episode was produced by Carla Abreu, James Battershill, and Ayodeji Rotinwa, and the theme song was Odyssey by Edward Abela. If you liked today's episode, please don't forget to subscribe on your podcast platform of choice, share it with your friends, leave a comment, leave a review. All of those things really help us get the show heard by more people. And if you loved the episode and you'd like to hear more like it, then you can support us in the making of these episodes by heading to opendemocracy.net/donate. Thank you so much for listening, and have a great day.